Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that yet.
Bill Maher just tore into AOC and the far left for what he calls their headlong dive into socialism, and the backlash was fierce. In this narrative, Maher has been warning about Zohran Mamdani ever since he announced his run for New York mayor. Now, with Mamdani portrayed as having won, Maher sees figures like AOC riding the rising socialist wave, and he livid. Buckle up, this showdown is being set up as an explosive clash.
What do you say to the skeptics, though, in the party, or want to keep him at arm's distance, some who have some problems with him, even some fellow New Yorkers in the swing districts outside the city?
Get to know him. Get to know him. You know, this is not about having any kind of hard line. I think that if anybody is skeptical, I would say get to know him. And once you get into a room with him, kick the tires yourself and make your own assessment instead of just kind of making assessments from what you may see on television. If you have the ability to meet someone in person, you should meet them before you judge them.
AOC is portrayed here as pushing back against critics like Maher, who argue that Mamdani and his hard-left platform won't just hurt New York, they could jeopardize the Democratic Party's entire 2028 strategy. Maher and others claim that elevating a proudly socialist figure is political roulette, the kind that turns off moderates and arms opponents with fresh talking points. But AOC counters that people should actually get to know Mamdani before rushing to judgment. The irony, of course, is that she rarely extended that same courtesy to figures like Donald Trump or other conservative candidates. So her sudden appeal for open-mindedness comes across to some as selective empathy rather than sincere principle, sparking skepticism across the political spectrum. And in this storyline, Maher wasn't about to let that slide.
I know the kids think that stuff that happened before their appearance on the planet didn't really happen, but it did. We've run this experiment many times, and the results are always obvious. Here's capitalist South Korea at night from space. Here's socialist North Korea. Yeah. In 1990, Venezuela was wealthier than Poland, but then Poland, finally free of Soviet-style economics, went all in on capitalism. And now their economy is as big as Japan. And people there have high wages, low inflation, cars, vacations, homes. Meanwhile, Venezuela traded capitalism for Hugo Chávez's Socialism for the 21st Century, which turned out to be like socialism in the last century, or any century, a mess. It turned one of Latin America's richest countries into one of its poorest. Low wages, high inflation, shortages, outages, 8 million people fleeing. If you think New York can somehow reinvent this wheel, you're in for a rude awakening. Zohran can't make your wishes come true. You're thinking of Zoltar. Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mamdani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that yet.
Maher is sounding the alarm again, and this time, he's not holding back. He argues that the left is practically inviting electoral defeat by rallying behind Mamdani and his unapologetically socialist agenda. To Maher, this isn't bold leadership. It's political self-sabotage. He warns that by elevating candidates who champion what he sees as fringe ideological experiments, Democrats are jeopardizing both their credibility and the trust of everyday voters. Rather than widening their tent, Maher believes they're shrinking it, pushing away moderates and independents who are looking for practical solutions, not ideological battles. In his view, the left is sleepwalking into a crisis of its own making, and he urging them to wake up before it's too late. But did they listen? Not at all.
This election is taking place when we have an administration in Washington which every day is moving us toward an authoritarian society.
This is America, New York City. Don't let them tell you any different. Don't let them tell you that we are the exception. We are the rule. And we set the bar for America. I'm talking to you, Donald Trump.
Let our words ring out so loud tonight that Andrew Cuomo can hear them in his $8,000 a month apartment. New York is not for sale.
It's interesting how figures like Bernie Sanders argue that America would flourish under socialist policies, even though their own success has come through a largely capitalist system. Their careers, book deals, speaking engagements, and public influence were all made possible by structures they now argue are fundamentally broken. Critics often point out that neither they nor their ventures would likely function the same way under the brand of socialism they promote, yet they keep pushing their agenda as though the rules wouldn't apply to them. That the ironic part, advocating for sweeping redistribution while enjoying the comfort, freedom, and opportunities that capitalism helped create. It ideological purity delivered from the safety of a very cushy perch.
It turned one of Latin America's richest countries into one of its poorest. Low wages, high inflation, shortages, outages, 8 million people fleeing. If you think New York can somehow reinvent this wheel, you're in for a rude awakening.
Maher is quick to remind New Yorkers and AOC that the city can't simply reinvent socialism by sheer force of optimism. In his view, history is full of places that tried similar ideological experiments, only to falter under economic pressures. He argues that New York won't be the miraculous exception to what he sees as a long track record of failures, no matter how passionately its leaders try to rebrand the ideology. The irony, he notes, is that AOC recently claimed New York is the rule, not the exception. If that's true, Maher warns, then New Yorkers should be cautious. If the rule becomes what he considers failed socialist policy, the result won't be prosperity, it'll be a predictable and entirely avoidable decline.
Zoran can't make your wishes come true. You're thinking of Zoltar. Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor Oval Office last week.
Maher then shifted his focus to Bernie Sanders, pointing to a socialist-style policy the senator once championed in Vermont, one that, in Maher telling, unraveled as soon as it met real-world conditions. It's the pattern he loves to emphasize. These ideas often sound elegant on paper, almost poetic in theory, but the moment they're tested in practice, the cracks widen, the costs surge, and idealism collides with economic reality. Maher argues that Sanders' Vermont effort didn't simply fall short, it fell apart dramatically, like a house of cards, illustrating that good intentions can't replace sustainable, workable governance. In his view, socialist policies tend to promise fairness and equality, but frequently end up delivering shortages, inefficiency, and financial strain when implemented at scale. And Vermont, he notes, wasn't some hostile political battleground. It was a friendly, supportive state where such ideas should have had every advantage. Yet even there, he says, the system buckled under its own weight. For Maher, that the cautionary tale the left refuses to acknowledge even as they push similar proposals on a far bigger stage.
Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor the Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that yet.
Maher, in this telling, argues that Bernie Sanders and AOC aren't traditional Democrats at all. They're socialist Democrats, guided more by socialist ideology than by the broader, more moderate Democratic platform. He insists that this distinction matters, especially when their proposals drift far from what he believes mainstream voters actually support. What sharpens his criticism even more is the irony he highlights. Both Sanders and AOC have achieved their careers, influence, book deals, and national visibility through the very capitalist system they often criticize. Maher doesn't deny capitalism's flaws. He openly acknowledges that it can be unequal, messy, and frustrating. But in his view, it remains far more effective than socialism, which he argues has historically struggled with stagnation, shortages, and political dysfunction. To him, capitalism isn't perfect, but it does encourage opportunity, innovation, and upward mobility, advantages he believes rarely thrive under socialist systems. Maher's message is blunt: criticize capitalism if you want, but don't pretend socialism is the superior solution while benefiting from the freedoms and prosperity that capitalism uniquely provides.
Now, Mandani seems like a nice guy, and I congratulate him on an extraordinary political achievement. But before the whole left side of the country catches socialism fever, let's listen to the other big winner in last Tuesday's election, Virginia Governor-elect Abigail Spanberger, who, before the 24 election, said things like, "If the party didn't shift to the center, we will get torn apart. And we need to never use the word socialist or socialism ever again." Well, she was right, but they didn't listen. Typical, am I right, ladies?
They brushed off Abigail Spanberger's warning entirely, and now, at least in this narrative, the DNC appears to be drifting headfirst toward embracing full-scale socialist-leaning policies. What makes this shift even more striking is how closely it resembles the rise of the woke movement, loud, ideological, and driven largely by the fringes rather than the party center. It not moderates, independents, or everyday Democrats pushing this direction, but a small, hyper-vocal faction that prioritizes radical transformation over broad appeal or electoral viability. And what even more notable is the silence from the rest of the party. That silence isn't neutrality at permission. By declining to question or challenge the most extreme voices in their ranks, they allow those voices to shape the party identity and trajectory. Spanberger, in this interpretation, saw this coming years ago and urged a return to a more pragmatic, voter-friendly path. But without leadership willing to confront ideological overreach, her warning went unheeded. Now, the DNC is portrayed as inching toward policies that could cost them not only elections, but also the trust of the very voters they claim to represent.
At least the party has a clear choice here, very clear. One wing is saying don't ever use the word socialist again, and one is saying,
I am a democratic socialist.
Clear, huh? So how do we decide who's right? Well, it turns out we don't really have to flip a coin. We have the evidence. In 2024, 13 Democrats won in districts Trump also won, all moderates. This isn't rocket science. All the left-leaning think tanks have done autopsies on 2024, and they all came up with the same message: move to the center. Even the New York Times, which did so much to promote woke politics, now says the partisans are wrong. Moving to the center is the way to win.
I've said it before on this channel, and I'll say it again. The DNC is long overdue for a return to the center, and for dropping the woke theatrics that have pulled the party into political quicksand. In this analysis, those tendencies weren't just a minor misstep. They were a major reason many voters felt exhausted, frustrated, and disconnected from a party that seemed more focused on symbolic ideology than practical, real-world solutions. But instead of recalibrating and embracing a more moderate, pragmatic approach, the DNC, at least in this narrative, has taken an even bigger misstep, doubling down on socialist-leaning ideas rather than examining what went wrong. That shift pushes the party further left and risks alienating moderates and independents, the voters who often decide national elections. It's a strategic blunder that suggests party leaders are paying more attention to loud activist circles online than to the broader electorate. If Democrats genuinely want to rebuild trust and regain momentum, they'll need to acknowledge that Americans aren't looking for fringe ideology, they're looking for competence, balance, and common sense. Until the DNC embraces that reality, they may continue stumbling into avoidable losses.
So they're quiet quitting capitalism and texting socialism that they're down to. Thing is, socialism will f you. Because socialism, to put it simply, just doesn't work and has never worked. Like Kevin Federline.
At the end of the day, the message is unmistakable: the DNC is standing at a crossroads, and the decisions it makes now will shape its future. Critics like Maher have been sounding the alarm for years, arguing that embracing socialism and fringe ideology isn't bold leadership but political recklessness. Figures such as AOC and Bernie Sanders may see themselves as pioneers of a new direction, but their rise has been fueled by the same capitalist system they frequently critique, highlighting what many view as a glaring gap between ideology and reality. Meanwhile, much of the Democratic Party remains silent, allowing its most extreme voices to define its identity while moderates and independents drift further away. In this narrative, history and practical experience suggest that socialist-style experiments rarely hold up under real-world pressures, and Maher warnings aim to remind voters of the consequences of repeating those missteps. If the DNC hopes to survive and succeed in the elections ahead, it must return to pragmatism, reclaim the political center, and focus on solutions that resonate with everyday Americans instead of chasing ideological purity. And that brings us to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this.